In this conversation, I'm going to be telling a story of two different types of realities. And the realities basically are contrasts to each other. And I'm going to be highlighting the nature of that contrast in a bid to drive home a point which I really want to make in this, conversation. And what is that point? Have you ever stopped to think about the nature of reality? I'm not talking about the reality as described by mainstream science in terms of physics and trying to decipher the objective nature of this reality. I'm talking about a reality that is the product of experience. Because if there's something our self-awareness is experience. And experience is the evidence we have of the experiencer. So that the only way that we know that we are is that we experience what we describe as a reality. Now, what is it that typifies this experience? Well, that's the beginning of this conversation really, because that experience is typified by the presence of an absence. That's really what it is. We experience a reality that we seem not to know anything about. We have to work hard to find out anything we need to find out about this reality. We seem very isolated in that sense, in the sense that we don't know anything. That fact that we don't know anything is typified by the childbirthing process. When we come into this reality almost like a blank slate. Now, we are not entirely blank, because we are inheritors of an ancestral type of memory, which is what we call our genome. And if you have listened to my podcast on the biochemistry of living memory, you should have a fairly good idea of what I'm talking about. It's a long podcast because there's 6 parts to it, over 500 minutes of science and rage against what we describe as white supremacy. But that's not the topic of this conversation. This conversation is building on that, in a sense, okay? Because this reality, which we experience as a physical type of reality, is typified by the absence of this knowing. Because we don't know anything. We don't know what we are. We don't know where we came from. We don't even know what we're doing here. Every time we look for that information, we need to work hard. For instance, if you follow mainstream science, then you have to perform experiments based on theories. So people sit down and they imagine the nature of reality. And they describe that imagination as theories or ideas that can be tested via experiments. So that when experiments are designed, they are designed to test particular aspects of this imaginative narrative that the individual has concocted. And if you have been listening to me for all this while, you would have realized that when you imagine the nature of a reality, that imagination is not outside of yourself. What you have simply done is you have imagined an aspect of yourself, and you are trying to see if this aspect of yourself conforms with what you perceive to be the flow of natural reality, of a physical reality. That's where science comes from. That's where the test of hypothesis comes from. Because you make an idea, based on your own observations, and these observations are coming from the way that your material senses interpret a reality. Okay? So what are your material senses? They're talking about your sense of sight, your sense of hearing, your sense of taste, your sense of smell, even your sense of touch. And there are some people who have various combinations of these in ways that lead to what we describe as extrasensory perception. But we're not going to go in there for now. We're just going to assume that these material senses are your basic 5 senses. Okay? So when someone imagines a particular type of narrative, which they call a hypothesis or a theory, they are able to describe that narrative in ways that are precise enough such that they can make predictions about them, or they can use them to make predictions. So basically, when you have an experiment being conducted, it is being conducted to test very specific aspects of an idea. That's why it's very important to be able to define ideas as very precise things so that you can now test different aspects of those ideas. And that ability to falsify via testing or experimentation is at the bedrock of what you consider to be the mainstream scientific enterprise. Because by doing that, then the original narrative, which is the original imaginative narrative, can be polished in a sense. And it can be polished over an extended period of time. So that gradually, the narrative begins to conform with whatever it is the true narrative of reality really is, because reality, as it appears to our material senses, it appears to be something disconnected from us in that sense, so that we intuit the existence of an objective type of reality. And because we are not objective people, how can we be? We are subjective beings, meaning that we do not exist outside of the way that we feel about these things, so that it is almost impossible to disconnect our feelings from the acquisition of whatever this reality information is supposed to be. So the idea of mainstream science is to disconnect the individual perceptive feelings from the nature of an objective reality. If you have been listening to me for a considerable number of times, you would realize that I have always asserted that such a thing is virtually impossible, because it is trying to find out the nature of a reality without the experiencer. And yet the only tool available to the experiencer is the acquisition of his own personal experience. So that everything we find out eventually, no matter the narrative and the structure of the polishing of that narrative, can only be asserted to be aspects of ourselves. That's really what it is. The only thing that can be found out in a narrative, no matter how polished it is, no matter what the experiment is, no matter what the falsifiability or the testability of a theory is, it will always come down to the nature of a personal experience. And that reflects the fact that when we are born, we do not know anything. We do not know what we are. We do not know where we are. We do not know who we are. We do not know anything about a universe that we seem to be experiencing all around us. So that in order to know, we have to make effort. We have to put in the work. And that work is equivalent to knowing ourselves. That's really what it is. So that at the end of the day, the only type of knowledge that is open to experiencing beings to be able to acquire is the acquisition of self-knowledge. That's really what it is. It doesn't matter what you call it. You may call it mainstream science in terms of physics, chemistry, biology, whatever. It doesn't matter. Because there is the unification of all reality into oneness. There is no aspect of reality that is physics, and no aspect of reality that is chemistry. There are no distinctions. They are only one experience. And that is typified by an analogy. For instance, when you perceive yourself, you do not perceive yourself as the 50 trillion cells that you are made up of. You perceive yourself as one thing. And somehow, some way, you are disconnected from knowing precisely what each individual cell is doing. There are 50 trillion of them within you, and you call yourself all of that. The evidence for that is if one of those cells is transcribed from you and put into a different human being, the human being will reject the cell. Why? Because the individual cells of that human being will notice or recognize that cell as a foreign body. Why? Because it's not one of us. And yet you do not perceive yourself as each of these individual cells. It's an analogy, you understand? It's the same thing with the universe. We feel extremely tiny about this universe, this physical reality that we seem to inhabit. We feel disconnected from it somehow, but yet we know that in some way, somehow, it is us. And this is what makes quantum mechanics very difficult to understand. Because mainstream science is not really clear on what it is that it is dealing with. Why? Because mainstream science originated from classical mechanics, and classical mechanics based on Newtonian physics is the idea that the individual, the experiencer, is separate from the universe that he is experiencing. That's the bedrock of classical physics. Now, by the time you move into quantum physics, you begin to get a different notion. The notion that the experiencer is a key part of the experiment that he is experiencing. Now, this should be obvious right from the bat. The fact that it isn't is because classical mechanics makes a difficult choice to exclude the experiencer. Okay? Now, looking back at this, you would see why it was done. And I'm not going to go into all that. But the reality of the matter, what I'm trying to describe here, is that we seem to belong to a universe that is somehow disconnected from us on an individual level. After all, we do not know what the universe is really made of. We do not experience its granular detail. We only experience it on the level of the scale that we inhabit as human beings. And we know that somehow we are in the middle of these scales because we have seen what the microstructure is made of, and we have seen what the macrostructure is made of. And somehow we seem to inhabit the middle layer. Now, the thing about the microstructure and the macrostructure is that they're both very simple to describe. Mathematically, that is. That is, they are both very simple to describe on the level of a precise narrative. Now, where all the complexity lies is in the scale that we inhabit. For some reason, the scale that we inhabit seems to harbor chaos. It seems to harbor things that we call complexity. So that all the complexity that we notice appears to be on our scale, and that scale appears to be, coincidentally or not, somewhere in the middle between the micro scale and the macro scale. Now, how is this possible? But that's the essence of what I'm talking about. A reality system where knowledge appears to be separate from the individual, and that knowledge is self-knowledge. Because no matter what you understand about the universe that you seem to inhabit, that universe is you, in a very real sense of the word. So that when you do not know anything about the universe, you do not know anything about the reality of yourself. Now, in my last podcast on how nature or how God built the universe, I asserted that the universe is mind, a primordial mind. It is the expression of a supreme intelligence. Now, you as an individual born into this universe appears to be that you are born into the presence of a supreme intelligence, and yet you know nothing of that supreme intelligence. Now, what happens if this is not the case? If this is not the case, that leads us to the next type of reality, which I'm asserting here. A reality where knowledge is so pervasive that everything is known. And following my last analogy, what this means is that imagine if you could know what every cell in your body was experiencing, because it is you. So that in such a universe, you are born into absolute knowledge of everything, every movement, every possible expression is you, because that knowledge is you, because that universe is you. Now, what typifies this particular type of reality is that you do not need to make efforts to know. Knowing is the natural state. And so what that means is that there is no aspect of that reality wherein self-knowledge is not available. And when I mean self-knowledge, I mean all of self-knowledge. So you do not experience a physics, you do not experience a chemistry, or a biology, or geology, or economics. You do not experience any of these things, and you do not experience individual people as separate from yourself. You experience all of reality as yourself. And as a result, you have absolute self-knowledge. Now, the infinite nature of that self-knowledge is God. That's who God is. It is the asymptotic limit, that is the end of infinity, which is unattainable, really. So that it represents a continued expansion towards the absolute nature of self-knowledge. At the limit, that's where God is. That's who God is. So you are essentially on a journey where you are aspiring towards God. So that you are constantly trying to meet God in terms of the knowledge of self that you possess. So that you can envisage this as the expansion of that self towards an infinitude, an unknown infinitude, an infinitude that can never really be attained. But it's the journey. Okay? Now, what typifies this reality? It is not a reality of pain and misery and suffering. It cannot be, because those things come from ignorance. A typical example is that, for instance, nobody willingly, just normally, under normal conditions, goes about trying to hurt themselves. You do not do things to damage yourself under normal conditions. But when you are in a state of ignorance, I'm not talking about ignorance of a particular subject, because all subjects, all discourses, they converge to self-knowledge. This is the entire point of this argument I'm making. And it's a theme that is in all my podcasts. How all knowledge really is knowledge of self. Because your experiential nature cannot really be separated into individual discourses. You are oneness. Okay? And you are. Now, the individual discourses are distillations, fractional distillations into the nature of individual experiences. An analogy would also be the 12 houses in astrology, the 12 astrological houses. They're not really separate things, or the 12 astrological signs. They're not really separate things. They're one thing. That's the way that experience is broken down to help and to aid understanding. But the idea behind all astrological studies is a unification of these 12 houses, or these 12 signs, or the functional lights, which you call planets. It's a unification of everything. And that is the reason why I do synthesis, not analysis. Because the crux of the matter is a unification of that experience into oneness. Because you do not experience yourself as individual houses or as individual functional lights. That's not how nature is built. Nature is a pervasive oneness. What we are as individuals is on a journey to reconcile our individual experiences to this oneness. That's why there are many of us. You know how many people there are on the planet now? There are 8 billion people. So what you're looking at are 8 billion perspectives on one reality. If you do not understand the nature of self-knowledge, then the result is conflict. The result is ignorance. It's a test. And the test is such that there are 8 billion of you with 8 billion different perspectives that are really the same perspectives. There's really only one perspective. But these perspectives have now been multiplied, or this perspective has now been multiplied 8 billion times. So that it is begging for unification. It is begging for reconciliation. And that is the test of what life is on earth. That is the test of what self-awareness is on earth. It is a cry for unification. A cry for unity. And how is that unity going to be achieved? Well, it's simple. You have to drop out of the game. The game is that you are billions of people. You're not. You're just one mind. Because the universe is entirely made up of one mind. And it looks as if it is separate because knowledge is restricted. That means self-knowledge is restricted. So when you look at a star, or you look at a galaxy, you're not really looking at a star or a galaxy that's light years away. You're looking at yourself. But you don't know this. The fact that you don't know this is the distance to that reconciliation. It is the distance to unification. So that when you look at a star and you say that the star, for instance, the closest star to Earth is Proxima Centauri. Proxima Centauri is said to be 4.2 light years away from Earth. Proxima Centauri is not 4.2 light years on Earth. Light is a stream of consciousness. The distance, 4.2 light years, is the distance between you and your reconciliation of what Proxima Centauri is, because it is not a star, it is you. That's really what it is. And if you find this very difficult to believe, it is because of the distance that exists between a self and itself. Between a self and its own awareness, so that next time you look at another human being, and you're conversing or you're having a relationship with some other human being, that's not what you're really doing. You're having a conversation with an aspect of yourself that is projected as another human being. Now, the human being seems very separate from you in that they do whatever they want because it's their reality also, okay? But the reality of the matter is that that is an aspect of you that is disconnected from you. Now, why do you think peace comes from the fact that when people get together and understand themselves better, they're able to achieve an accord? Why? Is because by expressing themselves, they're able to share the knowledge that each and every one carries of themselves. That's what it means to find an accord, to come to an agreement. Do you think it's a coincidence that if you could give someone a snapshot into exactly what it is like to be you, there would be no quarrels anymore? Because what do you think a quarrel is based on? A conflict comes from separation. The separation is a result of the fact that you know nothing. You are born into a reality system where you don't know anything. And so you begin the process of acquiring knowledge. But every knowledge that you acquire is self-knowledge. And that is the game. Because you are told that every knowledge you try to acquire is separate from you. That's not true. And that is the disservice of mainstream science. Because the objective of mainstream science is to acquire control over this reality. And so its format or its formalization is a means to that end. But that's just a formalism. The reality of the matter is that knowledge has not changed. Now in my book, The 5 Principles of Organized Complexity, I put forward 33 axioms of knowledge. Very important. Because they describe knowledge as indivisible, immovable, unchangeable, static, and fixed. Now there's no such thing in the physical universe. But that knowledge really is the mind that is this universe. It is that knowledge that everything is trying to evolve towards. Why do you think living things start off from single cellular organisms and evolve towards multicellular organisms that are capable of self-consciousness? What is self-consciousness but the acquisition of knowledge? So you think evolution evolves more complex, self-aware beings by chance? Of course not. Its goal is to achieve a mimicry or a replication of the absolute supreme intelligence. Of course, it will never be able to do this. It's an asymptotic approximation. And that means that all living things, especially self-aware ones, they evolve towards the nature of the supreme intelligence. And the evolution means a transformation of what we consider to be a physics. And that is why, as we acquire knowledge, as we acquire self-knowledge, and as it deepens and sits within us, we transform physicality. Because there is no physicality. If you've been listening to me, you realize that physicality is electromagnetics basically playing a game on us. But that's because our brains are electromagnetic in that sense. We run on electricity. And on my podcast on the Prime Signal, I talk about this in detail, where electromagnetism comes from, what it is doing. But the reality in this podcast is that we experience a reality system that we know nothing about. It appears that we are disconnected from it. Now, we're not truly disconnected. Why? Because our cells don't ask us what to do before they do things. The subatomic structure of matter arranges itself into living things. It doesn't ask our permission to do this. It is doing what comes naturally to it. It is doing what it has been programmed to do. And that program is coming from a supreme intelligence. The nature of mind, the primordial mind that is the entirety of existence itself. So that we appear to be some type of band-aid that is just pulled off the surface of the universe, so that we come into existence as a result of this programming of the universe, even though we have no idea what that programming is. Don't you understand what that configuration means? It means that this existence is a test. It's a test because we start off by perceiving a distance between what we naturally are and what we are aware of. That distance is what we call the size of the universe. Now, when I hear people talk about the size of the universe, it puzzles me. Size compared to what? There's no outside of it. So when people talk about the universe being big, what exactly do they mean? Big compared to what? Because from where I'm sitting, because there is no contrast and no possibility of contrast, then the universe might be infinitely large or infinitely small. It makes no difference. Because there is nothing to compare it to. There is no outside of it. But I am telling you in this podcast that that infinitely large or infinitely small is nothing. It's you. So when people talk about space being bounded, what are they talking about? Space is infinite. And the reason why space is infinite is because it's not a thing. It's the awareness potential that is infinite. And that has to be the case because at the end of that infinity, whatever such a thing means, that's God. So that space really is the distance or the potential volume that humankind needs to fill up with self-experience. That's really what it is. So that when you think about space travel, you're not thinking about rockets. The very idea that you need to ride on some type of rocket and propel yourself towards some star, some galaxy is nonsensical. Because when you are trapped in that type of paradigm, you will never go anywhere. Alpha Centauri or Proxima Centauri, like I said, is 4.2 light years away. A light year is about 9.6 trillion kilometers. How are you going to propel yourself? It's impossible. These are nonsensical statements, and they come because awareness or experience, as the experiencer, which is a human, is experiencing that reality. It is telling itself a narrative that is disingenuous. It's an erroneous narrative because it does not latch onto the true nature of reality. And the reason is because the formalism that has been envisaged or has been invented to describe the nature of that reality is more concerned about profits. It's more concerned about control. Okay? So it is more invested in separation. That's what it's invested in. So it tells itself stories about an objective universe. If only I could build a large enough telescope, I could see everything. If only I could build a large enough microscope, I could decipher everything. But those things are not outside of you. They are you. So that in order to understand the very structure and foundation of the universe, you do not need a telescope. You do not need a microscope. You just need the proper narrative. And it is that which we are here to acquire. That narrative. And now, the challenge is made even worse because now you have religion coming to tell you about the nature of what that narrative should be. It comes to you and says that it has all the answers. But the reality of the matter is that if it actually had all the answers, the world as we currently experience it will not look like it is. The world is in conflict. The world is in chaos. People hate each other. You have to, you don't You cannot imagine the level of hate that sits within a human being to implement a reality system like we have today, where the entire peoples of the world are graded into different categories based on how much access they have to the goodies of the world. And this is not a coincidental reality. This is an engineered reality. Now, what is doing this to humankind? Because this is not the natural state of self-awareness. Now, when a child is born, the degree of the ascendant in your astrological natal chart represents the moment when a child comes into existence. But what is the nature of that existence? What is the nature of this entry point? It is the change in awareness. So that when the child is born, it is born with an absolute curiosity in some sense. Because it doesn't know anything. And it doesn't know what it doesn't know. So it is assimilating information about the new reality it has been injected into at a rapid rate. And before it is born, the child is equipped with the potential to understand everything. Now, when it is born into a physical reality, the brain begins to undergo a remodeling. That's what accounts for the neuroplasticity of the brain. In the first 2 months of life, the brain is literally getting rid of connections it made that are no longer needed, because the plasticity of the brain must mold itself into the reality the child has been born into. This is the basis of astrological thinking. Okay? That's really what it is. So that what we consider to be birth and then the growing up process, it really is a process of dealing with ignorance. And the major form of that ignorance is not the reality around us, because there's no such thing. It's the nature of self. The child doesn't know what it is. And the whole of human life is the process of getting to know what being a human is. And so we literally encounter different types of experiences. Love, hate, abundance, all sorts of things. We experience fear. We experience loneliness. We experience starvation. We experience desperation. We experience joy, happiness, comfort. We experience a broad range of emotions. Why? Because these are the ways that we are telling ourselves the story of what it means to be us. And the general idea is that all of those emotions, feelings, thinkings, everything is informing us of the nature of what this reality really is. Because this is what we are here to acquire. That's really what it is. It's really that simple. But the transition point needs to be made between realizing this and realizing it as a conviction and just having it in your head as some type of information. Because having the information does not help. You have to realize it as a conviction. And that's what these life experiences are all about. That's why in your astrological natal chart, there are 3 points of realization. That's really what it is. They are the signs of Cancer, the sign of Scorpio, and the sign of Pisces. They are powerfully emotive realizations, because realizations are emotive things, but realizations are meant to generate convictions, and it is convictions that change reality. Now, the aim of all of this is to acquire the abundance of knowledge that the Supreme Intelligence has already laid out in front of us. We are in a universe displaying the highest possible forms of knowledge. I mean, look at the natural world that we're born into. We have no idea how it works. And so we begin the process of learning how the natural world works. How did life come into being? What is a plant? What is an ecosystem? How is sustainability achieved and maintained? We see all these different cycles in nature. We observe them, we study them, but we're not studying nature, we're studying ourselves. Because those cyclical processes, whatever we think of the harmonization of nature, right? Even the aspects of nature that appear to be very cruel in terms of how animals have to feed on each other, how there's tough competition within these ecosystems. We're not observing ecosystems. We're observing different aspects of ourselves. But we don't know what these aspects are. And we don't know how these aspects can be ourselves. We have no idea what this really means. That's why we are here to learn them. So that the universe really is some type of kindergarten for consciousness, for self-consciousness. So we are surrounded by the end of it in terms of the implementation of the most impressive aspects of that intelligence. Because without it, we won't be here. And then we are placed in a situation where we know nothing of it. And what do you think the task is? The task is to know about it. The task is to go towards it. So that it appears to be some type of invitation. An invitation to learn. But the learning process itself is a remodeling. Because as we know more about this supreme intelligence and its implementation, We are changing who we are. We are changing what we are. So we are going from a state of ignorance with all its attendant fears, because the fears that originate from ignorance are responsible for everything that we consider to be socially ill today, in that sense. Everything we consider to be evil, because that is the nature of ignorance. Ignorance breeds evil. It breeds wickedness. It brings hate. It breeds fear. It brings isolation. That's what ignorance does. And ignorance is a state that is typified by a consciousness that feels rejected. It feels alone. It has no connection to anything. And when you do not connect to anything, you cannot know about anything. And then you feel very small. And so when you look up into a universe, you see the universe as consisting of 93 billion light years across. And you see that you are just an infinitely small speck that nothing or no one cares about. That is the wrong direction. You see a universe that is expanding away from you at such a rate that different aspects of it are disconnected based on the speed of light. This is the wrong direction, because there's no such thing. That is the nature of ignorance. And all it breeds is more fear, because people live in fear now of aliens coming to come and attack them. What are you talking about? Do you really think that if such a thing were possible, there would be any life left on Earth? Earth is a paradise. It's a jewel, literally, in the infinite blackness of space, right? You think if they were such pirates or such beings that just want to come kill everybody and do what? And steal what? What exactly do you want to steal? The most rare thing you can find in existence is a human. Because if it's gold, it's so abundant, it's useless. If it's diamonds, they're so abundant, it's useless. So what exactly do you want to steal? If it's water, there's water everywhere in the universe. Everywhere. So what? Stars literally create these things. There are hundreds of billions of stars in the Milky Way galaxy alone. There are trillions of galaxies. So what exactly would motivate an intelligent being to go raid another planet or raid another? These are nonsensical things. And they're stories that emanate because the human is telling itself that type of story. But the root of that type of story is ignorance. It is ignorance that breeds evil. There is a different type of reality. That reality is the nature of paradise. Why? Because you don't need to work for knowledge. Everything is known. And so at every moment in time, there is no separation between you and anything else. You know what you're looking at, and what you're looking at is yourself. And you know precisely what this means. And you know how such a connection is possible. You meet another human being, that's you. You meet any type of experience, you know for an absolute conviction that that experience is you. You know it through and through, just like you know that you are self-aware. So there is no doubt. There is no hypothesis. There is no imaginative narrative. You know, and that's it. And as a result of that, the entire universe shrinks into nothing. There is no expansion of anything. There are no stars and galaxies or all these things. These are nonsensical things. They don't exist. Now, while you are ascending that ladder towards this type of state of self-awareness, then crossing the perceived distances between the universe or between the stars or between the galaxies becomes a matter of mind, not rockets, not technology. Like I've told you, technology is a demonstration of ignorance, because there is nothing more technologically sophisticated, if you want to call it like that, than the human. The human is beyond imagination, really. It's a marvel of something we don't even understand. So what are you going to engineer into existence that is beyond the human? Most people who don't think so, it's because they haven't really delved into the details. The details, a single cell, for instance, your liver cells. The liver has over 500 different functions. There is no organ in the human body that even comes close in terms of what it's supposed to be doing. Maybe except the human brain, and that is a maybe. It's the largest organ in the body. Most people don't realize that. If you're going to do a liver transplant or whatever, you don't have any device currently in existence that can take over the functions of the liver successfully. You have for the heart, you have for the lungs, you have for the kidneys. There is none for the liver. That's how complex it is. And the functional form of the liver are called hepatic lobules. You should go look at them. They're literally nature's attempt at hexagons. Why? Because hexagons are made up of the sixes. which are the most efficient way of achieving anything. And nature is always trying to display the greatest efficiency possible because it is the result of a supreme intelligence. And a supreme intelligence figured out how to achieve the entire universe from nothing. Now tell me what you're going to invent that is going to be greater than that. No. We're not here to create anything. We're here to learn. And what we're learning is about ourselves. And as we know more about ourselves, we are able to connect with ourselves, because you can begin to understand that the other person really isn't an other person. It's you. So what are you bothering yourself thinking how that person feels? The real question you should be asking yourself is how you feel. Because however you feel, that's how that person feels. So the moment you implement fear, ignorance, and hatred against that other person, you have implemented your own ignorance, that you are not aware that that person is you. And as a result of that, the universe continues to recede away from you. You begin to experience a universe that is flying away from you at astronomical speeds. And so within your mind, silos begin to emerge, typified by aspects of the universe that are disconnected from each other because they are farther away than the speed of light can ever cross. Silos breed dysfunctionality because they are the physical embodiment of ignorance. Now, the actual universe, which is the supreme intelligent mind, has no such silos within it. There are no aspects of it that are disconnected from anything. Everything is connected seamlessly. The seamless connection across all scales of a one universe, of a holistic united universe. That's what I call the prime signal. And it's not a hypothesis, it's not an idea, it's an absolute truth. So that in order to go from one aspect of the universe to another, you don't need a rocket. You don't need propulsion. You don't need heavy launch boosters or whatever it is that all these space exploration companies tell you. These are nonsensical things. I know they don't seem like that now, but the truth is that if you depend on those types of things and you think that you will incrementally find a way to boost your propulsion systems to the point where you can warp space and time so that you can boost yourself, these are nonsensical things. They are erroneous narratives from a corrupt brain or a corrupt mind, because there's no such thing. There are no light years, so to speak. And so the search for extraterrestrial intelligence that depends on scanning the entire universe for electromagnetic waves that are the result of some type of civilization. Look, if you find such things, stay away from it because they're as crazy as you. There is no intelligence in this universe that uses such things. That's really what it is. Now, I have a theory that I've been proposing for a very long time in terms of an idea. And I say, look, the universe literally as it appears to us in the physical form is a quarantine system. When you are not cured of your own insanity, that is when you are still in the grip of ignorance, which means that when you have decided to dissociate yourself from the prime signal from which you came, because you came from the prime signal, all living things, all existence is organized by the prime signal. Once you dissociate yourself from it, you see a very different type of reality, and that reality tries to get rid of you. So you die, you age, things break down, and you see yourself circling a star that is literally disconnected from every other star by distances that are insurmountable. That's the nature of your perception, because you must die. And some people think that this is reality that is set in stone. It is not. When you begin to listen to my podcast, the 6 podcasts I have created on the biochemistry of living memory, you will realize that life was created not to die, because the supreme intelligence does not die. It doesn't age. So that these things are a function of the internalization of ignorance. And that means that they are the product of a story that is being told at the root of consciousness. When that story changes, reality changes, because convictions change. And some people may think that this is such fantastical and nonsensical, it is almost delusional. But it's not. Everybody today in the mainstream science believes that the universe is expanding. 100 years ago, nobody believed such a thing. Do you think the universe just started to expand just recently? Yes, it did. Because that's the story that you're telling yourself with the instrument of conviction that you have created. Because that's what science is. Mainstream science now becomes the instrument of conviction because it is dependent on material evidence. And convictions are built from evidence. But the evidence you achieve is always connected to you. Because after all, if you don't have your 5 senses, what will your evidence be based on? So that your 5 senses are literally telling themselves a story. And it is upon that story that you populate evidence. Now, imagine that this was not the case. What type of evidence will you acquire? Many people will find it hard to convince themselves that they are, because our five senses couple us to what we consider to be a physical reality. That coupling of the five senses as a means of acquiring knowledge about reality, that's what we call the astrological sign of Taurus. It is the nature of the ruler of Taurus, which is Venus. And that is why in my podcast I describe Venus as a vector, because that vector is the clarification of the chaos that is the physical reality. So it's a pattern that is imposed on reality, but that pattern really is you. It is a story that you are telling yourself. Now, it is Taurus means that it is the first expression of what you consider to be material reality. And so it is extremely powerful, because without it, how do you know what is real? So that the error that the human being experiences really, that forces it to tell itself an erroneous story, is right in the heart of Taurus. So that Taurus is where every human being begins to experience this sickness that generates the erroneous narrative about this universe that we're living in. So that the cure really can also be found in Taurus, in Venus, at least from the astrological point of view. That's really what it is. Ever heard of in the narrative of the Torah, ever heard about the narrative of golden calf? What's a calf? A calf is the baby form of an ox, a bull. But that bull is Taurus, because these are not real things. Okay, these are not historical things. These are psychodynamics. Okay, because we're talking about the nature of the human experience, what it means to be self-aware. And if you have been listening to my podcast, I have consistently told you that self-awareness is a narrative. And the type of reality that is experienced is tied to that type of narrative, the root narrative. And that this root narrative, it springs within the individual like a tree. It is a story. And it is that story that builds conviction. It is that conviction that patterns reality as its fruits. And that this is not a conviction that is changed by a matter of will. Because by the time these convictions are forming, your will or your ability to form your will is not present yet. And I've given the example many times of, for instance, your kidneys are doing something. Your liver is doing something. You are the one telling that kidney what to do. You are the one telling that liver how to behave. But you're not aware of it. That's the nature of conviction. You are not aware of your convictions, and yet they are there. They are created by you. It is the ability to change these convictions, to approach the convictions in such a way that you can change them. That's what natal chart synthesis really is all about. That's what healing really is about. That's what the transformation of life really is all about. Why? Because that seat of conviction is one of the most guarded places in your psyche. Anything approaches it without your permission or without your whatever, you annihilate it, you neutralize it immediately. So it's a very dangerous thing in that sense. So that it is approached with caution and with permission. Okay? Because from there flow realizations. And realizations are such powerful things. They change you as an individual. Can you imagine the type of realization that changes the nature of the physical universe? You think it's magic? It's not, because there is no physical universe, so to speak. There is nothing. There's only you and the story that you are telling yourself in the presence of what you consider to be a supreme intelligence. You don't even know that the supreme intelligence is there. But that is what differentiates this reality from paradise. You ever heard of, in the Torah narrative, you hear of Gan Eden or the Garden of Eden, and some people think it's some type of physical place on earth that they're looking for. This is nonsensical. It's a state of consciousness, a primordial consciousness, where there was no difference between you and the awareness of the supreme intelligence. So that there is a slight difference, but that difference is only the smallest amount needed to create a slight quirk in that awareness, so as to experience a little bit difference. Otherwise, how would you say you? And yet, despite this tiny difference, you are absolutely aware that that difference is apparent. It doesn't really exist, because you and the supreme intelligence literally are one and the same. That's the nature of paradise, and it is typified by absolute knowledge. The Torah narrative tells you that when God created Adam is not an individual. These are not historical narratives, but is the archetype of the self-questioning model which we describe as human beings. He brought everything in existence to Adam so that Adam can name them. And whatever he calls them, that's what they are. Who do you think Adam really was? What do you think these narratives are all about? They are telling you that there is no physical reality, so to speak. And so you see that in the narrative itself, what you consider to be an original sin really is a change of perception. A perception that created the need to know via contrast. So that in order for you to understand the nature of big, you must understand the nature of small. And as a result of that, you force yourself into a reality system that is a duality. And as a result of that, not a curse, as a consequence and as a result of that, if you consider yourself to be alive, then you have to die. Because that's the nature of duality. And duality becomes the nature of the conviction in that reality. And as such, the human being develops what? A physical brain. Yeah. That physical brain is what now makes childbirth difficult. Because the human being has at birth, that is, body to brain ratio that is the largest in the physical world. I mean, a child is born with the size of a head that is not suitable for its body, because the human child's head is very large compared to its body. And that's because the human being has a brain. That brain is the embodiment of all what you consider to be reality. And that's what now makes childbirth difficult. That brain, according to the podcasts I have released, the 6 podcasts on the biochemistry of living memory, that brain is what is killing us. Because the brain is the primary oxidizer in the human being. Okay? It needs oxygen. But this is not who we are. This is not what we are. And as we dissociate from the erroneous narratives and we begin to reconnect on the trajectory towards the supreme intelligence, this begins to change. Everything we consider to be physical reality begins to change, including the nature of death. Because death is something that is forced into existence by the need for duality. If it doesn't exist, nobody would understand what life is. The requirement for contrast is because ignorance exists. So that in order to achieve a state that is non-ignorant, you now have to do work. You have to learn. You have to study. But that process is a connection. You have to connect with what? What are you connecting with? The supreme intelligence, right? But you are really connecting with yourself. So that when you pick up a flower and you're looking at it, you look at how beautiful it is. You look at all the intricate structures. What you're really marveling at is the organized complexity of it all. But what is organized complexity? Because within that organized complexity, I have proven many times that it contains the physics of blackness. That blackness is a connection. So that when you look at a flower, it is inviting you to connect with it. The difficulty with connecting with it is that you think that it is outside of you. You think that it is separate from you, because that is the conditioning of your birth. And so you struggle to understand what the flower really is. What is it saying? Why does it look so different? And this is the pain that every living human being is carrying within their soul. It is the pain of ignorance, the pain of disconnection, the pain of isolation. And people express pain in different ways. The way that we express it on this planet is through hate, envy, wickedness, cruelty. We create a world where we cultivate misery and suffering, and we dying. I mean, how many people have been born who have died? Can you think about that? Where do you think they go when they die? So that what we have as a physical reality really is some type of apparition. That is the story as it appears in front of our eyes. And believe it or not, the narrative that we call mainstream science is such a powerful conviction. It's not helping. It should be helping if it really is the search for truth. But it's not helping because it's not really the search for truth. Its goal, its job is literally to maintain the status quo of the world as it is. And that world, that status quo is killing us. Now, you can say, oh, but modern technology is making people live longer. These are nonsensical things because these are just narratives. What is the point of living longer? Is that what you really need as a person? No. What you need as a person is to live forever. That's what you need. And if you have listened to my podcast on the biochemistry of living memory, you will realize that the fact that people cannot live forever, or the fact that living things decay and die, is because there are certain biochemical processes that have been neutered. Because whatever you say of the Torah narrative, the tree of knowledge of good and evil was not the only thing in that garden. Because there was really no garden. I mean, these are just euphemisms and metaphors and allegories. Why? It's because the truth is so powerful, you have to be introduced to it gradually. But I'm afraid the time has run out. The time for kindergarten has run out. The world has approached a point where you must come to the realization, or every single man, woman, and child is at potential for death. Because the world is about to make a leap. Some people think it's a technological leap. You haven't been paying attention. There is nothing like a technological leap. These are nonsensical things. Because you are the greatest technology. No, there's nothing. People talk about UFOs. And how many UFOs have you seen with propulsion systems, with rockets and all that? These are this is not the way to think. Because there is something wrong with human thinking. But the problem itself is not in human thinking. The problem is in the Taurian aspect of reality, the acquisition of information through the material senses. Some people in Judaism are talking about the sacrifice of a red heifer, in order to construct a temple, the third temple of Solomon. These are allegories. These are not normal things. People take these at such face value that it tells you where we are in terms of human understanding. Okay? Because the only temple of God has always been the human. That's it. Why is it a temple? Because you're self-aware. I've told people many times that it is a travesty to see a human being trying to imitate the behavior of an animal. It's a travesty. You don't realize how much travesty that is. It's such a travesty because if there's anything, you are so far from the reality of an animal. So far, you cannot even compare. Because the human being is equipped to be on a journey to the supreme intelligence. An animal doesn't even know what that is. And yet you are trying to behave like an animal. You want to live according to the rules that animals live by. But where do you think those animals are? When you look at those animals, what do you think you're really looking at? You're looking at your roots. You're looking at aspects of yourself that are filled with ignorance. Because you don't know what they are. So you see the lion trying to eat a gazelle, and you wonder, you say nature is cruel. But what is that lion? What is a gazelle? How could you describe the existence of a lion? How can you say what a lion is? You have never been a lion, have you? You don't know what it is like to be a lion. So how can you know what the lion is experiencing as a reality? If there's one thing we know about what a lion or any other animal is that it doesn't know what it is. But it is unburdened by the burden of not knowing what it is. It doesn't know that it has a burden. It doesn't know and it doesn't care. In summary, it doesn't know what it is. It doesn't know that it doesn't know what it is. And it doesn't care that it doesn't know what it is. And that's a state of existence that has no access to the supreme intelligence. None whatsoever. You can describe it as some type of automaton. It is driven purely by instinct. But that's not what you are. Your brain has reorganized itself and has begun to mimic a certain resonance structure which I call the prime signal. It's the physics of blackness. That's the only reason why you don't know about it, because the world, as it is envisaged today, is against that blackness, so as to keep you in a state where you believe that you will build a rocket to Proxima Centauri. What are you going to do there? People talk about going to colonize Mars. Imagine destroying this paradise on Earth so you can go and colonize Mars. Mars is a dead world. If that is not enough to convince you that there's something wrong with human thinking, then I don't know what is. Because that's a travesty in and of itself. Imagine thinking that you can build love amongst human beings by genociding another group of human beings. This is not the way to think. All the evidence that something is terribly wrong with the way the perception of reality is all around us, but we choose not to see it because we have conjured up another type of narrative that we have given greater precedence. We have created an alternative to the supreme intelligence. We created something else that we want to listen to, and we're following that. But if only you could see the reality of what that is, because everything in existence is compelled to follow the supreme intelligence. There's no real choice in the matter. You are just allowed to perceive the illusion of choice. Why? Because that is the way that you describe your self-awareness. And so if you must tell yourself that you're a self-aware being, you must have the illusion of choice. But the reality of the matter is that there is really no choice. Choice in what? Everything is compelled to answer the one supreme call. And this is not a religious thing. Who cares about religion? This is physics, at least on a granular level. Okay? So if you disobey that one unique call, basically what you're saying is that you have become cancerous. Because that's what a cancer is. A cancer is part of an organism that says, look, I don't care what everybody else is doing. I'm going to do my own thing. Here I am lord of my own rings. And so I'm going to behave and organize myself the way that I want. Well, if that cancer spreads, to kill the entire organism. And so the body, your physical body, has systems in place to detect these anomalies and to get rid of them immediately. Why do you think it is different on a larger scale? When people imagine that they can be different to the one supreme call of this intelligence, then you are setting up the same thing, but you don't know. Because you think that it's a rock slamming into earth to create extinction. That's not how these things work. I mean, a rock might have slammed into earth to wipe off the dinosaurs, but you're not a dinosaur. There's a huge difference between you and a dinosaur. You are self-aware. And that means that you have access to some type of narrative that you can imagine that you create. And that's where the extinction comes from. It creeps in through that type of narrative. It begins to tell you stories of how you need to kill yourselves. And it provides that narrative with evidence. After all, Einstein once said that no mouse will ever create a mouse trap. But human beings have created weapons for their own total destruction. Do you think it's normal? That's not the normal way that life thinks. So if self-awareness leads to that destination, that's because the root narrative in self-awareness is corrupt. And some people think that they imagine this to be religious narratives. There's nothing religious about what I'm saying. Because religion is also part of that problem. It's a narrative that separates people into different camps based on who the supreme intelligence is. Can you imagine that? I mean, a supreme intelligence that has no distinction between the flower that you hold in your hand and the waterfall as it's falling down a mountain. There's no distinction. So if there's no distinction within the creation of a supreme intelligence, how can there be distinction within the perception of that supreme intelligence? That tells you that there's something wrong with the narratives. So when you look at all the major religions, there's something wrong with them. Because if they contain a truth that delivers a conviction of truth and understanding, meaning a conviction of self-awareness, the truth of self-awareness, the result would be a singular perspective on the supreme intelligence. And that singular perspective means that there are no more separations and there are no more divisions. And the entire world, what you call a physical reality, immediately changes. It changes. It's like a miracle. It's like magic, but it's not really magic. It is the evidence that what you call a physical reality doesn't really exist. It is an extension of you. So that the void of space really is the void of ignorance. So if you see space expanding, it is because ignorance is expanding. And people struggle with this realization because they say, how can ignorance be expanding when the world is more sophisticated or more technologically advanced than it has ever been? What I'm trying to tell you is that is a lie. The world is not advancing anything. The world is at the greatest point of its ignorance because knowledge is self-knowledge and self-knowledge is typified by unification. People are more hateful than any time in human history. People want to kill themselves. You have no idea. People have drummed up all sorts of narratives to eliminate and extinguish each other. It's a qualification of the nature of self-experience. So if you're experiencing yourself in such a way that you want to annihilate others, then what you're really telling yourself is that you don't know anything. Because there is no other for you to annihilate. You want to annihilate yourself. And the only reason why a self-aware biological being will be telling itself a story of self-annihilation is because it is aware of its own corruption. It knows that it has become cancerous. And the only reason why the Supreme Intelligence has allowed this is because that point of self-awareness regarding the nature of the corruption, it's a very important point in human history. Why? Because human beings, based on the way that they have configured themselves and their reality, they only seem to be able to make changes at such inflection points. And so the Supreme Intelligence, his plan, is to bring all of humanity to that point. You will face your own extinction and you will decide for yourself if you want to go ahead with it. And so the world will become increasingly dangerous. These are not speculative things, I can't even call this prophecy because it's not prophecy. It's just understanding the truth. And I've always told you that once you keep your eye on the truth, then there are no mysteries anymore. Nothing. And what is this truth? The truth is that the true nature of reality is paradise, typified by absolute knowledge, typified by absolute connection, no separation anywhere. And you perceive that by realizing that these connections are not outside of yourself. They are you. The process of learning is the process of deciphering these connections, illuminating them within yourself. And that when you are fully aware of these connections and they begin to grow, that is the nature of the prime signal. That's what I call organized complexity. Because you recognize that you are part of something that is always united, has always been united, without the possibility of separation. And once enough people begin to understand this, it begins to spread across the world. When you meet such things in form of personal interactions, you call it love. That's really what it is. Because love is a connection. It's an understanding of what it is like to be another person. That's it. It's not some type of abstract quality or something that is only orgasmic, because the orgasmic aspect of it is a quality of that paradise. Because you want to know what absolute knowledge feels like. It's orgasmic. Where do you think we come from before we incarnate on this planet? Where do you think we come from? Paradise is orgasmic, ecstatic bliss that grows infinitely. That's really what it is. So that when you experience this fleeting orgasm as a physical sexual experience and you hunger for it, what you're really hungering for is paradise. That's really what it is. And the people who hunger for it the most are the ones who remember it the most, even though they don't know what they're remembering. And that is the nature of Scorpio in your astrological natal chart. That's what Scorpio is. That's why Scorpio is such a difficult sign, because you're dealing with something that you don't even know what you're dealing with in terms of this memory of paradise. You have no idea what it is. And yet it is within you as a vague memory, pulling you, forcing you into some type of behavior, because that behavior is part of your life experience towards the reunification or rectification of unity. Very powerful thing. That's really what it is. And so I started this narrative by talking about the contrast that exists between two different types of realities. There's a reality where nobody knows anything. It is typified by ignorance, typified by separation, and typified most especially by fear. The fear of aloneness. And then there's the other reality, which I call paradise, typified by absolute knowing, a total lack of separation, absolute connection, love. Okay? That's really what it is. So that in that reality system called paradise, there is no need to try to know something. You are in a constant state of absolute knowing in an orgasmic, ecstatic experience that grows infinitely. That's really what it is. When you contrast that with this type of experience that we're having here, that type of experience does not allow for the cultivation of human misery and suffering. It does not allow for the cultivation of death, because there is no need to contrast anything. The process of contrasting is a process of interval measurement. You need to measure the distance between two concepts as a way of understanding what they mean, so that at the root of that interval is the need for meaning. You see? That distance is the nature of space-time. That's really what it is. So that space-time itself is a measure of what? Ignorance. And as ignorance disappears, and I'm talking about self-ignorance, as self-ignorance disappears from the collection of humanity's consciousness, space-time begins to shrink to nothing until it totally disappears. There's no such thing. That experience of the disappearance of space-time towards a type of orgasmic reality system of ecstatic bliss that grows infinitely without the possibility of misery and suffering or death, that's where we're all headed. And we need to prepare for that. And the preparation requires a change in the nature of self-perception, which means a change in the fundamental narratives that cultivate self-awareness. Currently, those fundamental narratives have been replaced with what you call religious narratives per se. Nobody understands them, because if they did, it would have started the change already. But what we see is that the change hasn't happened. People are trying to kill each other. So we need to remove these root narratives. And we cannot replace it with science, mainstream science as it is, because that is also nonsensical. Okay? Because its aim and its cultivation is not to engender the truth. So we need to replace these mainstream narratives, whether it be religion or science. We need to replace them with the principles of organized complexity. Because the principles of organized complexity describe a reality that really is the constant awareness of the supreme intelligence, as the physics of blackness. And the evidence for that reality is found all across all of creation. I will leave you with an example. The technological company called Apple today. How do we know what Apple is? It's because Apple produces products, technology products, consumer good products, from your desktop computers to your laptops to your phones, all sorts of things, right? And every time the company Apple produces such a product, they stamp their logo on it. That's how you know. You know because they want you to know. Now, if you knew nothing about the company called Apple and you experienced the reality of these devices that they create, at some point in time, you begin to ask yourself, what exactly does this logo mean? And it wouldn't take long before you put it together that the reason why certain types of devices carry this logo or this image is because they originated from a company called Apple. It's the same thing with organized complexity. Organized complexity demonstrates that all natural processes, all naturally occurring complex systems of which you are one, they carry the logo of that organized complexity. It's a very definitive logo and it is made up of these sixes. And so my podcast on the biochemistry of living memory scours the mainstream media, the mainstream publications in science to prove to you that this logo exists at every aspect of your living being. That's what it does. It's a 6-part podcast. It's very long. It's over 500 minutes of evidence. Now, if you look at any other system, every other naturally occurring complex system, you will find the same logo. What does that tell us? Is that all of these systems came from the same place because they are organized in the same way. And the reason why they're organized in the same way is so that they can connect seamlessly. For instance, your Apple products connect seamlessly. There's the option for that. It's not a coincidence. All right. Your phones, Apple phones connect with your Apple computers, connect to your Apple TVs, blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on. And that's the reason for the branding. It's also the reason for organized complexity. It's so that every scale of what you consider to be existence connects with itself seamlessly into a unified whole. That's the evidence. And if you discount the evidence, then you have chosen to remain in ignorance. And ignorance in that form, that is the nature of denial. And denial is a river that leads to extinction, always. Because the only thing that can save from denial is truth. That's it. Truth is the nature of freedom. Now, if any of you have been listening to me over these couple of years, you will realize that astrologically, the nature of freedom is Aquarius. That's what Aquarius really is. You know, Aquarius is symbolized by a human pouring some type of water from a vessel over the entire earth. Well, these are just symbolisms. You must understand what they mean. Aquarius is not a water sign. It's an air sign. The water itself is a very specific type of knowledge. It's a knowledge that connects seamlessly such that it looks like water. I mean, air is really what water is if you just increase the energetic nature of the molecules, right? But that's really what it is. But the knowledge is a different type of knowledge. It is the only type of knowledge possible, really. It's self-knowledge. The knowledge of self-consciousness. Because that is the only thing upon which truth can be built. It is the nature of truth. And that's why I started the podcast by saying that it doesn't matter what you learn, what you think you're learning, whatever discourse you think you're learning at your universities or your research centers. The only thing you're learning about is yourself. It doesn't matter whether you're looking in the Torah, or you're looking at your Quran, or you're looking at the mainstream science or whatever. You are the one doing the looking. You are the one doing the learning. So the only thing you're learning about is yourself. Now, the impact of what you're learning is in its ability to change you, but it cannot really change you. The only thing it can do is to free you from ignorance. That's the only type of change that a human being has the possibility of achieving. To free you up into your own truth, into your own convictions. Because based on those convictions, you can create the realities that you want. That's really what it is. So it is the ultimate self-empowerment. That's what freedom is. But freedom cannot be given to you by a state. So when you hear that, oh, you have human rights, I have no idea what these things mean. The fact that you are human means that you already have a natural sovereignty. So the fact that some state or some entity needs to give you rights is because that entity took away those rights in the first place. Nobody gives you rights. You are a sovereign. And that is the realization of Aquarius. It is the realization of a natural sovereignty. The natural sovereignty that allows you to seek truth. And so, with Pluto's entry into Aquarius permanently, starting from November 2024, then all human beings across the world begin the process of establishing the one and only truth. And that simply means that a filter system is created, because every perceived truth out there will now be passed through that filter. And this is a dangerous process. Very dangerous, because there's so many falsehoods out there. Now, all those falsehoods begin an existential examination. And any falsehood that is found to be a falsehood, it is rejected absolutely. That's the nature of Pluto. And any reality system connected to that falsehood is absolutely dismantled. What we're talking about is the dismantling of the world as you know it. And it's not going to be done by one group of people. It's going to be done by everybody. Because the initial reality is that everybody believes in their own truth. So they clash. But as they clash, certain truths begin to be revealed as absolute falsehoods. Now, the reality is that something will change in self-consciousness that represents a datum. That's what everyone is really waiting for, but they don't know that that's what they're waiting for. Something will change, and that thing will create a datum, that is a fixed reference point within self-consciousness that allows it to reflect upon itself and its so-called belief systems. And anything that is found wanting will be discarded. And all the realities connected to that thing that is found wanting, they will also be discarded. So what you're going to experience within the next 20 years is a total reimagining of the entire physical world. Now, it's up to individuals or up to groups to determine how that reimagining is going to proceed. Will it proceed violently or will it proceed amicably? It all depends on the nature of the falsehoods as they have been created initially. This is what makes it a very difficult time, because truth is something that becomes very difficult to promote or to acquire in the midst of falsehoods. The status quo wants to remain, but like I said, these astrological ages, they are not physical things out there. They are the progressive nature in the evolution of human consciousness. That's really what it is. They are mandated. There's nothing anybody can really do about them. It is what it is. Now, we can prepare for them because it is a filter. It's a great filter. And during such great filters, they are usually preceded by moments of severe turmoil. And in this particular case, this filter is extremely dangerous. Why? Because the world has never been the way that it is today. There are 8 billion people, and every part of the world is saturated in what I consider to be an extreme falsehood. So can you imagine the dynamics that are about to be unleashed? But do not fear, because fear is part of that disconnecting process. You must realize that if anything is happening at all, it cannot be outside of a supreme intelligence. So if that supreme intelligence, one way or the other, has brought everybody and everyone to this point, it is because there is a plan. Okay? So that's really what it is.